Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this afternoon session on titled Tech Across the Horizon. This session will present selected topics on cybersecurity, ranging from implementing post-quantum cryptography in national infrastructure to cybersecurity as it pertains to unmanned marine vehicles, to assessing intergovernmental cyber resilience. This session is 90 minutes long. We will have 3 presentations, followed by a questions and answer session, where we will have the opportunity to ask questions from the presenters. I will now introduce our 3 speakers. First we have Mr. Raymond Bierens. He is the strategic advisor to the federal CISO of the Dutch government, where he's identifying new and novel ways of assessing cyber resilience of governmental organizations in the Netherlands. This project allows him to apply his insights from his ongoing current PhD research at the Amsterdam Business Research Institute at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, and his position as chairman of the CTI sharing Connect to Trust Foundation. The central theme in all of these activities is to support decision makers in making the right decisions created by the increasing digital transformation. His former role as Global Vice President for Defense and Security and Cybersecurity with Atos provides him with the 25 years of experience to position in the MOD as a leader within government amidst rising geopolitical tensions. Our second speaker is Mr. Alexander Rohl. He is pursuing a part-time PhD at the University of Adelaide, Australia, where his work focuses on applying machine learning to automated protocol reverse engineering. His other part-time role involves cybersecurity and data science research at the Defence Science and Technology Group Australia. And our third speaker is Ms. Jelizaveta Vakarjuk. She is a junior researcher at Cybernetica and industrial PhD student at the Tallinn University of Technology. Her research focuses on post-quantum cryptography, privacy-preserving cryptography, and security of voting systems. Mainly, she studies post-quantum digital signatures, but also focuses on the aspects of migration to post-quantum cryptography. So the logistics of this session will be to start with the presentations, and after the final presentation we will have a question and answer session. So please wait with your questions until then and wait for a microphone, and when you have the microphone, please introduce yourself and pose the question. Also, we want to remind you all that we have a restriction on taking photos during the first presentation. So please do not take any photos of Raymond's presentation slides. So, without further ado, I'll hand over the floor to Mr. Raymond Bierens, and he will talk about assessing intergovernmental cyber resilience using open source frameworks and tools. Raymond, the floor is yours.
So as you can see, I'm part of the Federal CISO office of the Dutch central government. And if Koen can explain briefly what the Federal CISO Office does, and for those of you who've seen it already on the first day of the workshops. So it's sometimes called the emperor without clothes. So that means all departments in the Netherlands are autonomous. However, there are two mandates within the Federal CISO Office. The first one is the crisis mandate. So even cyber crisis comes in and it becomes bigger than a department. Together with the National Cybersecurity Center, the Federal CISO is the tandem in charge of coordinating. However, the second mandate is that it also has the policy mandate. And the policy mandate means that we are responsible for all questions coming from all politicians, from all media on the government. So we can go from using TikTok to managing crisis around Log4j, and anything by strategy is ours. And this program I'm responsible for talks about cyber resilience. And it started during the Log4j incident, where we actually were asked the question, how many instances of Log4j were there within the Dutch government? And that question turned out to be very difficult to answer. Instead of numbers, we got products. So we got the answer, we're using Microsoft Defender. So we think we don't have it, or we're using another product. We didn't want to know the product, but we did find the need to go beyond the tool, as we would call it. Because we found out that if you put 12 departments, as we have in the Netherlands, and central government being 140 different organizations, into a single room and start discussing their level of cyber resilience, you get an Indian tribe fight on tools. You have the open source tribe, you have the Microsoft tribe, you have the cloud tribe, and you have all those almost religiously defending their own tool. How far can we go when you take it to cyber resilience? And the advantage of having no clothes, as the emperor would say, having the autonomy means that we could only measure this in terms of technology agnostics. So we couldn't rely on standard reporting from tools because the tools varies, and we didn't have the mandate to provide or to prescribe a standard tool. So we said, so let's try to make it technology agnostic, but also let's try to make it open source if possible. Because as we've seen in the morning, there are many frameworks, there are many things available, but we try to make it as easy as possible. So what we said is, well, for us the answer became in two parts. So the first, we found out, and that's usually within government and any large organizations, the answer is somewhere out there, and we already found a number of security operations centers who were using a model called the SOC Capability Maturity Model. You can look this one up, it's on the web, it's open source. It is basically a spider diagram based on the NIST cybersecurity framework. So it's nothing fancy, it's just a very good way of assessing the maturity of your security operations. And this is where we started. And then quite quickly came up, while talking to those security operation centers, we came up with one main concern. Even if your cybersecurity or your security operation center is mature, you need also a mature IT organizations. And we found many cases where the incidents were able to detect, the tickets were made, and then the IT organizations was lacking staff, lacking skills, or lacking the tools to actually follow up upon. So we said, well, this is a halfway house. This means I can detect a lot, but I cannot respond. So you need, in order to get the full coverage of the NIST framework, you need something else. And we ended up in the financial sector. And for those of you who are from Europe, they may recognize the fact that in Europe you have the NIST 2 coming, which is for all sectors, but there is one sector leading the pack. They have their own regulation called DORA, and that's the financial sector. And in the financial sector is a Dutch bank called the Rabobank, and they had a very specific use case. They said, my biggest threat is North Korea. It's the biggest financial targeting nation, which is going for the bigger banks. And I need something to explain to my C-level, to my decision makers, what the state of my play currently is. So they took MitraTech, back in the day, and built a use case framework, which is very simply a very simple way of explaining what you can and cannot do. And that became the Magma framework. You can find this one as well. It's also on the web. Like I said, these are the 4 open source tools we started with. So 2 frameworks to begin with. So we went back to the CISO Council, as we call it. So that's where the tribe comes together. All the CISOs of the large departments are there. And we proposed for them these 2 frameworks. And they gave us back 3 specific missions before starting to use these frameworks. They said, check if we're not reinventing the wheel. That also meant don't make your own framework. Don't take international frameworks and make them local, because then you're losing time in making them local, and it makes international cooperation more difficult. Make sure the frameworks are future-proof. And please don't make another Excel table, which we have to fill out as part of the compliance. Jeff from Siemens this morning quite rightfully said, compliance is not security. So if you want to go beyond compliance, automate the compliance and preferably go beyond. So then we execute. So that means we're now in the stage where we're doing the first assessments. And to my own delight and surprise, this is about getting departments more money. Because this is an objective way of saying, this is what I can do, this is what I cannot do. So we have an over-subscription of departments who want to join in, which is great. It also means that we were tasked with another challenge. Because as we've seen during this past few days at CyCon as well, there is more than just the organization. There is suppliers, cloud suppliers, supply chain. It's all in there. And interestingly enough, we went back to RSA, and the only thing we added to the research question was the cyber resilience of the cloud suppliers to the Dutch government. And suddenly, and that's very typical of the discussion when you take supply chain into the mix, suddenly far little CISOs are actually engaged. For some, it's a CIO strategic question, sovereign cloud, non-sovereign cloud, different types of sovereign clouds. For some, it's a procurement thing. So they send in procurement, they don't send the CISO. But the CISO is out of charge. He's from the internal stuff, whereas the internal stuff is highly dependent on everything on the outside. So that was an interesting observation. And then secondly, we found the name supply chain to be wrong. Because supply chains suggest a singular chain. It's supply chain. But it's no longer a chain. It's an ecosystem. So what it meant is we started in assessing cyber resilience of our ecosystem, and that's what you see here on the screen. Quite interestingly enough, this goes quite well with the whole NIS2 regulation coming in. So that means that the NIS2 will introduce a supervisory authority for many sectors in the Netherlands. But since we're using open source models, we're now seeing that the supervisory authority for the non-governmental sector is saying, I want that as well. Because if it's available for the whole world, why not make it the duty of care, the definition of duty of care for a large organization? Tech is on the horizon as the theme for this CyCon. However, our imminent risk coming from the East is now. The first question you want to have in defense is, what can I do now? And that's not a question for research, that's a question for research to solve in the current state of affairs. And you have to be honest about it. So objective, preferably used by as many organizations as they find it relevant to use that. That's our biggest goal. Thank you.
So I see there are some of the audience still standing at the back. If you want to, you can find some seats here in the front. So our next speaker is Mr. Alexander Rohl, who will be talking about enhancing the cyber resilience of sea drones. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Bernt. So hi everyone, my name's Alex and I'm from the University of Adelaide. I'd like to emphasise that this work was a group project. So could I point out Gabor? Where's Gabor? Yeah, there he is. And Erwin, I didn't think, yeah, Erwin's there too. So they're also PhD students studying at the University of TalTech. And our supervisor, Olaf, he didn't want to fly all the way from Australia, so we've just got me from the University of Adelaide. So before I talk about enhancing the cyber resilience of sea drones, I just want to give some context into what the paper's all about and where does it fit in into what Raymond was saying. So we're going to end up building up a framework, and we're sort of going to take this as far as academia can, and we want to see this implemented in governments and military. So the paper essentially provides a comprehensive survey of threats to sea drones, and we define a sort of superset of the ship subsystems and external communication channels. They might not be applicable to all sea drones, but they're sort of a sufficient description. And we're going to go through the STRIDE threats and attack vectors for each. So if you don't care about sea drones, I'll at least teach you what STRIDE is. It can be applied to more than just sea drones. And also, we're going to look at deploying what mitigation measures can exist to sort of work against and protect these systems. So before I go into STRIDE, I want to briefly talk about what is a sea drone. So a sea drone is essentially an uncrewed ship. Some examples are Wärtsilä's IntelliTug, which is used to help maneuver large container ships out of the port. There's Japan's Meguri 2040 program, which is primarily for passengers and cargo. L3 Harris Autonomous Systems, this is producing uncrewed vehicles for defense and scientific research purposes. And lastly, we have the Järabjörkiland, which is a zero-emission container ship. So these are in a prototype stage at the moment, and that's why, as I'll go into detail, why it's important we're talking about the cybersecurity of these ships now before it's too late. So it might be obvious that, as I said, the number of crew in an autonomous ship is zero, but there's more we can do with these vehicles once no crew is on board. To provide further capability of these vessels, we require more actuators and sensors, and the interconnectivity of these components becomes exponential, allowing us to produce greater automatization capabilities. So take the Järabjörkiland, for example. So we want to consider what components do we need for this ship to be autonomous out at sea. So if we imagine the autonomous ship controller, it has components to do with its safety, the historian, external interaction, which I'll talk about later. But let's firstly focus on the navigation module. So the ship needs to know, firstly, localization, has to know where it is. And this component has to talk to sensors such as the GNSS receiver, the inertial system, digital maps, manometers, and the like. But once it knows where it is, it has to know what's around it as well. It has to have some kind of situational awareness component. So this relies on sensors such as sonar, radar, turbulence sensors, and AES transceivers. And so these high-level components help us automatically navigate the ship. We then need to be able to control the route somehow. This is obviously linked to the rudder and the propeller controls and the sensors and actuators that feed into this component. Depending on the ship we have, so in the case of the Järabjörkiland, it's a container ship. Perhaps these containers are sensitive to temperature, so we need to be able to control the temperature. In the case of a passenger ship, maybe we care about CO2, oxygen levels, or if it's a defense ship, we care about if the torpedo is armed and the state of the torpedo readiness. And again, the common theme here is this all relates to actuators and sensors. We're going to need some sort of onboard safety system. Even if there's no crew on board, we still care about if there's fires on board or water is intruded into the vessel so they can stay afloat. And lastly, we want to be able to monitor the engine, don't want to get too hot, if it's based on the sensors from the batteries and the fuel. So I've sort of given a high-level picture of when the ship is at sea, what are the components at the high level should we be worrying about? So what about when the ship is at port? So here's the lovely port of Tallinn, and we're going to talk about what we need to be thinking of about the external interaction with the autonomous ship controller. So there's going to be some sort of wireless external communications to the shore control center, to maritime rescue and authorities, as well as nearby vessels through AIS. There's also possibility, for even though the ship itself is uncrewed, we might still require maintenance teams to come on board and physically access the ship controller when in port. So I've described at a high level what are the components of a ship that we need to worry about. So now I'm going to change tact and talk about threat modeling. So we're going to use Microsoft's threat model Stride. And the reason we chose Stride is that it's from an engineering perspective. If I'm a designer or an engineer and I'm wanting to build these autonomous ships, well, what are the properties that I want on my ship? I want it to be authentic. If I know a message is sent from one component to another, that I can trust that it's been received. I care about its integrity. I don't want there to be any sort of backdoors or bugs. I want my code to function as intended. I care about non-repudiation. So that means if something wrong were to happen, I have a way of collecting evidence and logs about what had happened. I may want it to be confidential. It's this sensitive data on board. I want this to be stored correctly in a secure way. I may want some components to be availability. So the wireless communications is a great example. I always need to be be able to talk to authorities if there's an issue. And lastly, authorization. So if there's multiple users that can control the ship, maybe I want to assign different levels of privilege to these users. And so this is where Stride comes into it. So we have these engineers and designers thinking about these concepts, and the best way to think about defense is to think about how can these concepts be attacked, or how can they be degraded. So Stride stands for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, informational disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. So spoofing would mean how can I degrade authenticity by sending illegitimate messages around the system? Tampering, how can I introduce bugs or backdoors into a piece of kit to degrade its integrity? Repudiation, if I'm an attacker, how can I erase all logs of the fact that I was there in the system? Information disclosure, how can I extract information? How can I decrypt it and take it for myself? In denial of service, so how can I essentially flood a system that should always be available such that it's no longer available when needed? And lastly, elevation of privilege. So if I start as a low-level user, how can I gain more permissions and potentially pivot around different components of a ship? So this is the threat model we're going to use. So there's other threat models out there which are typically used for organizational risk and risk after something's been built. But we want to focus on Stride because designed with the engineer and designers in mind. So I talked about the high level of what the components are on a ship, but it's important to keep in mind that maritime vessels are a very large SCADA network. But the problem with applying Stride to every single piece of equipment is that we'll be here all day. It's not feasible. We need a framework that is actionable in a timely manner. So from our high-level understanding of the different components on board, we want to look at where are the logical separations that, as an engineer, I can start to introduce some of the mitigations that I've identified from the Stride model. So the obvious approach is where can firewalls exist in an autonomous ship? And that is how we break down these components. So you have all these OT subsystems, which through various firewalls are connected to the IT level bridge. And this bridge has to have some capability to be able to have wireless communications to other ships, and also communications with the Shore Control Center. And these communications, we can also engineer and design a firewall between these so that we can control what is being talked to the bridge. So it's probably a very complicated slide at the moment, but essentially in our paper we simplify this, and our core contribution is we produce these 8 subsystems that are pivotal to an autonomous ship, and we go through in detail all the different STRIDE threats and mitigations for each of these 8 scenarios to help provide a framework that can be sort of consistent across different engineers that are building these systems. So it's a very brief example of the process. So if I want to look at how can I degrade authenticity of an AI system by spoofing it, I can inject false values into various sensors and fool the system into making the wrong decision because it's reading the false value rather than a true value. This also leads to adversarial machine learning, and I'll give an example of that later. As an example of tampering, the supply chain, it affects all these various subsystems, and if an attacker can affect some sort of third-party component, inject a backdoor, and essentially degrade the integrity of that component. Repudiation, if an attacker was in the Shore Control Center, how could they launch their attack and erase their traces by deleting all the logs that the Shore Control Center has? Information disclosure, if we are to have physical access to the ship, perhaps we can plug in and connect to a database that's unencrypted and take that data off the system. Denial of service, as I mentioned before, wireless communications is a very typical vector for denial of service attacks, such as a DDoS. And lastly, elevation of privilege. So if I am in the OT system and it's been designed in a way that an OT system has some sort of user account to be able to talk to the IT system, can an attacker exploit some elevation of privilege to be able to control the rest of the ship by pivoting from just one vulnerable OT system? So that was at a high level an example of some of those STRIDE threats, and so the paper that's in the book goes through STRIDE for every single one of those subsystems. But my interest is machine learning, so I'm going to go through an example, go through in some more detail about spoofing. So as mandatory in a talk about machine learning, I've got my picture that's been generated by OpenArt. So I've asked it to draw an AI vessel. I'm not sure how long this vessel is going to last because it's got 6 ships headed straight into it, but we'll see how this one goes. So I want to talk about how can we spoof through adversarial machine learning an AI system. So if you had some of the tech talks yesterday, there were some great examples of this. But one reason I like this video is some of the previous examples, I'll let this video play a few times, some of the previous examples talk about how once you have an image, how can you sort of perturb it through noise to trick the classifier. But this takes it one step further. This example is from a few years ago. This example takes it one step further and looks at how can we produce an actual physical model with some sort of digital camouflage that can fool the AI without tampering with the actual image, the actual camera. None of that's being tampered with at all, just the physical object. And so what's happening here is they have a turtle and the default, they've got Google's Inception classifier, and it classifies this as turtle. And then they're going to apply some digital camouflage to trick it into classifying it as rifle. And it's not even just classifying it as rifle. From the height of the bars, you can see it's incredibly confident that this turtle is a rifle. So why should we be concerned about this if we're engineering an autonomous ship? So in this example, we've got a benign object that's being classified as malicious. And this is a problem, but it can also be a problem the other way. What if we were to have a malicious object, such as a submarine or torpedo, that our AI system has misclassified as a turtle and thinks it's smooth sailing? So even though we talk about STRIDE as being the ideal threat model for designing autonomous ships. There are other equally valid threat models out there. And the one I'd like to quickly point out is the MITRE Atlas, which goes through a kill chain approach from reconnaissance to impact about all these specific techniques to attack an AI model in the wild. So we don't just, it's not all doom and gloom in the paper. We don't just list all these threats and say, good luck. We explain what tools are out there and techniques to help mitigate these threats. So in the case of an AI model, how might we mitigate it being spoofed? We want to make sure its training data sets include sensor degradations or actuator failures, so these sort of extreme scenarios. And we can take this one step further and look at one of the research, how can we intentionally craft adversarial data and test that our machine learning systems are robust to this attack. And if we're going to use off-the-shelf models, we need to ensure that these come from trusted sources, because it's possible that you could have a backdoor in a machine learning model. So in summary, our paper is intended for military commanders and governments to put into a more formal framework to help design and engineer their own autonomous ships, which is what, from the examples before, is happening and is in its prototype stage. And essentially, we've put together this superset of subsystems and external communication channels. And from there, this framework is meant to be used to help detect what are the various stride threats and attack vectors, and how can, during the engineering phase, mitigate these measures. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions later.
Thank you for your presentation. And now our third presenter, Jelizaveta Vakarjuk, who will talk about identifying obstacles of post-quantum cryptography migration in Estonia. The floor is yours.
Hello, my name is Jelizaveta, and I'm going to present you the joint work we've done with my colleagues from Cybernetica, Nikita Snetkov and Peter Laud. And our work is about how to identify the challenges in post-quantum migration in different services. So, as far as you know, Estonia is really popular in its e-services and digital identity management systems, but all those services rely on cryptography. Unfortunately, the backbone of most of the services is public key cryptography that will be broken once a large-scale quantum computer will be available, because those public key crypto systems rely on two hard mathematical problems, factorization problem and the discretography problem, and the large enough quantum computer is able to break both. That's why it is really important to plan and switch our systems to quantum-safe alternatives. In this slide, I brought you an example of the most commonly used cryptographic primitives, both public key and symmetric key primitives, and how those primitives are used in Estonian e-services. The first four rows correspond to public key encryption, digital signatures, and key establishment. Those are used for the I-voting, for the data transfer, for general public key infrastructure, for the authentication solutions. And as you see from the slides, those will be affected by the quantum computer attacks. And the very last row is there to tell that actually these symmetric primitives, such as block ciphers and hash functions, are also impacted, but not in a such drastic way as a public key crypto systems, because for the block ciphers and for the hash functions, it is just enough to increase the key size and the output of the hash function correspondingly to have a certain security level that is still enough to provide security for the system. And before we go to the results of our work, I want to briefly say what the post-quantum cryptography is, if you are not familiar with this term. So the post-quantum cryptography refers to cryptographic algorithms that work on classical computers, our regular computers, but is secure against both classical attacks and the quantum attacks. And the common point of confusion when we are talking about post-quantum cryptography and quantum computers is to confuse post-quantum cryptography with the quantum cryptography, but I want to emphasize that those are different things, because the quantum cryptography requires some quantum devices to operate. And the example of quantum cryptography is a quantum key distribution. And those two families, the post-quantum cryptography and quantum cryptography, are there to achieve different goals. And some of the goals that can be achieved with post-quantum cryptography cannot be simply achieved with the quantum. And in this work, we focused only on post-quantum cryptography. Then really common question when we're talking about migration and quantum computer is when to expect this quantum computer. There is no certain point of time that the quantum computer will certainly be available and will break RSA or ECDSA. And I want to reference one of the reports that are there that is called the Quantum Threat Timeline Report. In this report, they asked different quantum computing experts to evaluate the probability of having this large enough quantum computer that will be able to break RSA with 2048-bit key in 24 hours. And they asked to evaluate the probability of having such a quantum computer in next 10, 5, 10, 15, 20, and 30 years. And as you can see, I'll try to point. The middle line is kind of a threshold time where the majority of the experts say that the probability of having such a quantum computer is 50% or higher. So the common time threshold that you can hear is somewhere around 50 years. We should be prepared for that. So what we did in this work, in the work we first of all gave an overview of the current state of post-quantum cryptography, what are the different standardization agencies doing, what are the recommendations, which algorithms should be considered. And the main focus of our work was to analyze different Estonian e-services and point out which are the problematic spots in trying to convert those services from the traditional cryptography to post-quantum cryptography. And in the work, we focused on the following services: the Smart ID authentication solution, ID card, X-Road, public key infrastructure, and iVoting. And I will briefly tell about those in a couple of slides. But before I go into details of the main things that we identified, I wanted to briefly say what is the current state of post-quantum cryptography. You can read more in our work, but here are the really main things that you should know right now. The first thing is that in 2016, NIST initiated the process to standardize post-quantum cryptographic algorithms, and they focused on the cryptographic algorithms in two categories: digital signatures and key establishment. And by now, there are standards for almost all the algorithms that are here in the slide. And there are additional rounds running for the digital signatures and key establishment, just to have a little bit more of algorithms relying on different mathematical problems to be sure in the security. So those are the schemes that will be future standards in post-quantum cryptography. For digital signatures, those are Crystals, Dilithium, Falcon, and Sphinx Plus, with Crystals, Dilithium being the kind of main digital signature that you should look at. And for the key encapsulation, right now we have just one candidate. This is Crystals Kyber. And I know that there will be some European standards coming that will be standardizing different key encapsulation algorithms as well. And very often when you read about post-quantum cryptography and the migration process, it is advised to use something that is called hybrid mode. And this is where you try to combine post-quantum cryptography with the traditional pre-quantum cryptography to ensure that while we are migrating from one system to another, we still can support some legacy systems. And if some attacks on the novel cryptographic algorithms occur, the cryptanalysis gets better, or some side channel attacks are found, the systems are still secure and protected with the pre-quantum cryptography. The first thing that I want to discuss is Smart ID. This is an authentication solution, authentication and digital signing solution that is used here in Estonia and in Baltic countries. And it is built on something that is called threshold cryptography. And the idea is that instead of storing the signing key, the secret key, on one device, we split it into two parts. Because if you want to sign with your mobile device, it is not really secure to store this private key inside the mobile device because the mobile devices are vulnerable to the attacks. That's why during the key generation, the key is split into two shares. One of the shares is stored on the mobile device, and the second share is stored on the server side. And when the user wants to authenticate to some service or to sign some document, the client and the server run interactive protocol, and single signature is created, which can be verified with the single public key. This is the main idea behind the protocol. And what are the challenges of trying to transfer this protocol to a post-quantum world? Well, among the signatures that I named before, the crystals dilithium is the most suitable one. Because of the underlying mathematical structure, it kind of allows more to do this splitting between the one device and another device, but it has still some major problems. And one of the main problems is something that is called rejection sampling. And I will try to briefly explain what it is. So when the signing algorithm is run, it does some mathematical operations, and then at the end of the algorithm run, we have almost ready signature, and then we need to check that the signature satisfies certain requirements in order to verify that the signature does not leak the private key. And the key point here is that if this verification fails, then the whole signing process needs to start again. But this is not really a problem if you run this signing on one device, because the computations are pretty fast and you do not see this time overhead. But when you will try to split the signing process between two devices in an interactive protocol where the parties need to exchange some messages here, and the requirement is that both shares, the share that the one device produces and the other device produces, they both need to pass through this verification check. This probability becomes lower, and the number of communication rounds that is needed to produce a finally valid signature is bigger. And the other problem is that if for the authentication solution, the standard compliance is not so important, but with the signatures it is. Because the signature that is currently produced with Smart ID is certified to be qualified electronic signature. For that, it should be compliant with the standards. But to produce the threshold algorithm that will output the standard signature, it is really a non-trivial task. And the works that are currently done in defining the post-quantum threshold algorithms, none of them produces standard dilithium signature. The next thing that we looked at is ID card. Basically, really similar application, creating digital signatures authenticated to some services, but it also gives you ability to encrypt and decrypt documents. And you might think that, well, we do not need any fancy crypto here, just create signatures, just encrypt documents, and that's it, but not really, because here all the cryptography is run in the smart cards, and the smart cards are constrained devices. The problem with the post-quantum algorithms is that they require bigger keys, they produce bigger signatures, bigger ciphertexts, and the mathematical computations that underlie the primitives are more complicated. That's why they are not so compatible with the current generation of the smart cards. Another important concern is side channel protection. This is what I tried to depict in this figure. And the idea is that when the smart card is doing some operations, either signing or encryption or decryption, then it is possible to measure the card, either its energy consumption or the timing. And if the algorithm is not protected against the side channel attacks, it is even possible to extract the private key, just based on the power consumption or the timing. And with the post-quantum algorithms, it is really a big question to protect those algorithms from the side-channel attacks, because those are more complicated and need some more clever ways and tips and tricks to do that. And another concern is that with current RSA-based solutions, we have this great trick that RSA crypto system allows us to produce both signatures and gives encryption and decryption functionality. But in the post-quantum world, we do not have any scheme that would allow us to do the same trick. One algorithm that can be used to create signatures and to encrypt, decrypt files. That's why we would need to somehow change the infrastructure and how the whole thing is run, and probably need to store many more key pairs on the smart cards to allow all the functionalities that the current ID card allows. The next system is iVoting. And here the problems are even bigger, because in the previously discussed solutions, we were just concerned about the digital signatures and encryption or key establishment. Those are like the simpler cryptographic primitives, but the iVoting is built on many, many building blocks, and it requires other complicated cryptographic solutions, such as zero-knowledge proofs, commitment schemes, mixed nets to anonymize the votes. And the problem is that since there is not so much research done even for the simpler cryptographic schemes, encryption, decryption, and digital signatures, there is smaller amount of research done in terms of more complicated cryptographic algorithms. And the current solutions that are out there, they are either insufficient in terms of performance, or they would require to change the whole iVoting system. So currently it is not possible to kind of take the iVoting system, split it into blocks, and say, I have RSA signature, and instead I will have the lithium signature, this encryption will be switched to this one, zero-knowledge proofs, etc., etc. No. It will probably be the fact that we would need to switch the whole system to support the algorithms that are there, post-quantum algorithms. And in this slide, I united two things, the public key infrastructure and the X-road, because they have a bit similar problems. So X-road is essentially a layer that allows for one institution to transfer the data to another institution in a secure way. And this is largely used for the governmental institution to transfer the data inside. And here, the most problematic point is that the cryptography that is used here is pretty simple. We need certificates, we need digital signatures. But here, the point of the hybrid cryptography comes in. Of course, this is also the problem for the previous solutions, but I did not tell about that because there are much more bigger problems with those. But here, we can think about the problems that come from the need to combine pre-quantum with the post-quantum. First thing that we need to choose is which of the suitable hybrid certificates to use. There are different versions out there, all with their pros and cons, but kind of the main point that differentiates them is whether we want to support legacy systems or not. Because if you want to support legacy systems, you would want something like your certificate will have RSA public key pair, and then the lithium public key pair. And then the systems that do not support post-quantum cryptography, they will be just verifying the RSA one, and the others will be verifying both. But this is not really a secure way, because if you can choose which one to verify, you will be verifying the pre-quantum, not the post-quantum, right? So there is a really need to analyze the system requirements to identify which of the schemes, which of the hybrid solutions is preferable by your system. And the same point comes with the digital signatures, because with the key establishment, this is not such a big problem to combine pre-quantum with post-quantum, because what you can do, you can run the pre-quantum key establishment, you generate some shared secret. You run the post-quantum key establishment, you generate shared secret, you feed those two secrets to the key derivation function, and you get your secret key, right? But with the signatures, it is more complicated. You can either concatenate the signatures, like RSA signature concatenated the lithium signature, or you can try to combine them in more sophisticated way, having the post-quantum signature to sign the previous pre-quantum signature. And all of those actually depends on your system, on your requirements, and what you want from your system to achieve. And now jumping to conclusions. So while doing this analysis, we have identified that actually there are only few obstacles that are common to all the systems. And this is really the point that I wanted to communicate, that it may seem that it is just a simple take pre-quantum signature switches it with the post-quantum signature, but it actually is not. The common point that is problematic for all the systems that I explained before is the increased sizes in the keys, public keys, secret keys, signature sizes, and the ciphertext sizes. It results in larger bandwidth and the storage requirements to have those post-quantum algorithms work on our devices. And other point that I wanted to make is that, unfortunately, there is no one scheme that will be suitable for all use cases. I cannot say, like, use crystals dilithium, it will solve all your problems. No, because there are many different signatures, all with their disadvantages, and you should choose which one is more suitable to your system. Maybe for your system, the fast verification time is needed. Maybe you prefer smaller signatures, then you need to go to Falcon. Maybe you want to have better understood security, then you will need to switch to Sphinx because it relies on the hash functions. So the key point is that each system should be analyzed separately with its requirements, both security requirements and functional requirements, to pick the post-quantum algorithms that are suitable for your system purposes. And that's it from me. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you. And now it's time to move on to the questions and answers session. And I expect that anyone in the audience who is eager to ask questions, just raise your hand and introduce yourself, please.
Hello, I'm Jaan Priisalu from George Mason University. And I would like to ask from Jelizaveta that did you also enlist this kind of risk indicators? Because now when we look at the ID card system, then exchanging ID cards will take 5 years. And you need also the development time and certification time, so 7 years beforehand. So if you assume 2030, actually, then it's late already. By what actually did you enlist actually, what are those things actually when people should run?
No, because in this work, we try to focus on, first of all, kind of trying to get more attention to the process of switching to post-quantum cryptography, because not many people think that it's urgent to start switching now, but it actually is. And some people say that it's also already late to start switching. So with this work, we wanted to kind of paint the seed and start telling about how important it is to switch to the post-quantum cryptography. But this is a really important point that you made, but unfortunately we did not have it as a goal of the work to list the risks for the systems.
Any more questions? I have a question for Raymond. So can you tell us a little bit about the user community in this project? How many organizations are involved?
In the Netherlands, it will be all of government. So in the end, it will be all 140 organizations. It's quite difficult to assess in an open source when you're using open source tooling to identify the exact number of users. We just can estimate the number of downloads, individual downloads from GitHub, which are in the hundreds per day. So it's quite an intensively used tool that increases every time the MITRE tech framework is updated, because it's a direct related to that. What we currently, our main focus is that we are using it within government. So we said, well, first we want to prove that it can be done, so that we actually have something to prove. That's also why we put some development capacity into developing both framework and the tools as a collective set to be used. And that's currently what we're doing. And the next question is, how much resources do you need to actually make the initial assessment? Doing it time and time again is easy. Doing it for the first time, you need to make sure that your tooling is properly displayed and that your maturity is also properly displayed. And the final question we are still solving is that and that's more a governmental discussion on information security, is that we are still working on the classification of the final report. Because if you have a full objective measurement of your cyber capabilities, then you know what you can see, but you also know what you cannot see. Therefore, the risk of an insider or attacker using exactly those venues where you have no capabilities is a risk, and that's an information security risk. So the report itself is something we, as for example, the Federal CISO office will never want to know. On the operational level, that needs to stay within an organization. However, for example, the National Cybersecurity Center, as a coordinator and supporter of those organizations, for example, may want to know. And that's one of the open questions. So how sensitive is the information which will come out of it? So therefore, we're now dealing with a testing community of the 6, I think, biggest governmental organizations in the Netherlands. And once we have that approved, we'll do one more final, what we call the SME level, so the small organizations in government. And then we'll put it out into the world to be used within government and beyond.
For Alexander, I was wondering, in your research into the unmanned marine vehicles, did you note any attack vectors or threats to these vehicles that was unique to the marine aspect of the autonomous vehicle, or does it sync with the autonomous vehicles as a whole?
Yeah, so all of the subsystems we described, I think, equally apply to land or air vehicles as well. There's a great example by Trend Micro today where they sort of remotely hijacked a car, and they made the point that this isn't an exploit, it was just designed without these principles in mind. I think the key difference that I see is that in a maritime vehicle is that you're going to have long periods of time out at sea with no close range connections. So you need that resilience has to be certain for a longer period of time in a more isolated environment. That's the main difference, but it all applies to land and the air domain as well.
And one more to Alexander as well. Actually, 2 questions. First one, do you consider, let's say, a disaster recovery scenario where the ship needs to go to some designated port of call while something urgent happens and the ship cannot navigate further? And the second one, if the ship is maneuvering, let's say, somewhere in a high-density area like the China Sea or something like that, where it's like a lot of small boats, fishing boats, like that can overload the system first, or it can present like an image that it doesn't correspond with the reality. Just for an example, there is a fishing boat and it catches fire. So it's no longer for the system as a fishing boat, it's a fishing boat on fire. Do you consider those options as well? Thank you.
So yeah, those are both great examples of an extreme scenario that may be untested. So that's where, is there a fallback for a human to control the ship in that kind of environment? Or is there a way that we can better simulate these extreme scenarios? I think that's where AI is very powerful, is that it can start to generate new things and it can be creative. How can we sort of use that capability to try and create these adverse scenarios so that we don't have to think of every single one ourselves? So I think in the next session, there'll be some talk on maritime ships. And yes, they'll be talking about how there's always like near misses that can eventually lead to catastrophe. I think that's a great example of that.
So there's a question. Someone with raising their hand. Go ahead, please. Introduce yourself.
Hello, Christopher Hunter from the United States Military Academy. I had a question about the quantum-based encryption. At the nation-state level, do you see quantum-based encryption and quantum-based like cracking being a tool only available at larger nation-states in the private sector? And what does that mean for citizen security?
Well, first of all, thank you for your question, but I wanted to do this distinction between the post-quantum cryptography and quantum cryptography. And I'm not sure if you're asking about the quantum encryption or the post-quantum.
Post-quantum, I apologize.
Okay, so I think that this is, first of all, it is important for all the companies that are using systems that rely on cryptography to, first of all, start with the migration strategy to figure out what are the crypto systems that are used in the company, and then try to come up with the plan how those pre-quantum schemes will be switched to the post-quantum schemes. The same for the state, for all the services that the state provides to the users. It is needed to come up with the migration strategy, by which time do we need to switch certain services to the post-quantum alternatives. And it can be different between different services because, for example, for some data, we want the long-term security. For example, if we encrypt some confidential data, we want this confidential data to stay secure within like 30 years. And if the quantum computer will be here in 15 years, then it is already late to try to secure those files. So it is important to do this like proper timeline on how to switch to the post-quantum cryptography. And then to the end users, I think this is, only we can do is to wait for the companies to make their systems secure against the quantum adversary.
I think one of the common themes in these three talks has been that to provide support for decision makers. And one of the challenges with this is that these are very technical matters, and the challenge of conveying technical matters to a decision maker who may not have a technical background you might have faced that, and I believe Raymond is doing his PhD on that topic. But I ask all the presenters, what is your view on this, and is there any way of mitigating possible miscommunication or misunderstandings?
Okay, I can start. I think that indeed in the field of post-quantum cryptography, it is one of the biggest problems to educate people, because if we are talking about just cryptography, it already scares people because it sounds, wow, too mathematical, I do not want to deal with that. But if we are talking about post-quantum cryptography, it is even scarier. And that's why it is important to do like smaller steps to try to convince people that this is like the urgent matter and we need to start acting now. That's why I think it is important. Well, of course, read please our paper because we try to write it in the simple way, not including any like mathematical details or complicated technical details. So it should be understandable by the wider audience, not only the people who are dealing with cryptography. And secondly, many of the tech companies I have seen, they are doing the blog posts where they are trying to explain in as simple as possible ways what the post-quantum cryptography is about. And there is a blog in our company as well where we are doing this kind of educational stuff, trying to tell people what the post-quantum cryptography is without going into much details about that.
Yeah, I completely agree that there's a lot of education to be done in cybersecurity broadly. But even though people understand it's urgent and there's risks, it's still being thought of as an afterthought. we need to have cybersecurity experts in the room, in the designing process, similar with post-quantum cryptography algorithms, have them in the designing process now so that for new systems, when needed, that it's being fixed in the design phase and not sort of retrofitted, because that's obviously very costly. So I think getting more security professionals involved early in the stages rather than later would really add to that.
I think I'll answer the question with an anecdote. I think everybody knows the company Heineken. If not, you'll know it tonight, most likely. I met one of the strategic advisors to Heineken. He's an English guy, and I met him at the London Business Schools. And he said that the Dutch are very strange people. They seem to be the only country who have an org structure and not use it at all. There seems to be sort of an informal org structure in each company in the Netherlands, which actually explains how a decision is made. And why that's relevant is that what we see, what I see in my own research as well, is that we try to convey a very technical topic on cyber resilience, quantum, autonomous vehicles to the C-level directly. The C-level in general has been trained over years to respond to a risk they can imagine. So what happens if a decision maker cannot imagine what will happen if the risk takes place? Is a ship in Baltimore losing control hitting a bridge, is that a risk you cover? But what you find in general is that in order to, at the moment, we are sort of changing the storyline in order for such a person to understand it. So we're exaggerating, we're nearing cyber war. So we're using old terminology from the Cold War, as we've seen in the panel earlier, to actually convey the same message. What I don't see is that people are, when they're faced with an invisible risk, there will be an additional validation process. It's like a human facing a lion, and then you're not seeing the lion, and another one tells you there's a lion. The first thing you do is you'll check if that's a true story. So you go to another person, are you seeing the same lion? And it's usually a trusted person. And for some C-level, that can be their children, which is a risk in itself, because they will see other things as well. But nobody actually really spends time in when they are confronting a decision maker by doing the preliminary work. So what's their decision-making process after you've met them? Then they will check, they will validate, they will ask for their risk and the general counsel on compliance. And they will need to go more beyond compliance, because any politicians we're meeting in government, as in the private sector, I've seen that as well, answering the question, why do we need to go beyond compliance? And is that money giving me any kind of additional assurance or return on investment? That usually is, when you go beyond compliance, the biggest question to ask and the most difficult answer to give. So that's why my advice would be, yes, you're still doing, they need to make the decision. They need to understand the risk, but there is the invisible aspect of digital risk is driving them into an additional decision-making steps, and make sure you understand them before you convey any kind of what I would call invisible digital risk.
We have time for one more question. Go ahead. You can wait for the microphone, please.
Then we have two questions.
Oh, sorry, my bad.
Here, in front.
Thank you. Sorry for making you run across the room. My name is Mattias Antonsson. I work for the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency. An easier way to say that is that we work with the civil defense. I run up the strategic cybersecurity analysis team. Firstly, a quick comment to what Klaus was asking is that there is currently work on an EU level on trying to figure out the thresholds for what an IT incident should be. And the overall idea is to make it, comparable across the EU, both to make it simpler for businesses, but also to create comparable data between member states. Another thing for Raymond is that we've actually done this twice to measure all the important and essential entities in Sweden in terms of their information on cybersecurity. So if you want to talk about classification of data sets, we can have that discussion afterwards. But to come to my question, it's actually around the role of the CISO. Because we've struggled a lot as we work closely with the CISOs, particularly in government organizations, that they don't have the mandate internally to bring through actual decisions. So do you have any advice, or how have you worked with that in order to go from understanding that there is a need to actually addressing that need? Thank you.
I think the biggest risk is in the governance itself. So who's the reporting? Who is the CISO reporting to? And to be honest, the two most which seem to be the most ineffective are the CFO and the CIO, because the CIO is the tandem. So it's quite strange to have a security professional reporting to an IT responsible person. What we're trying to convey in this project is that it's not about security, it's about continuity. So our problem starts effectively with the name. Information security officer, no, he is responsible for the continuity of an organization. Because without IT, including its ecosystem, there's no continuity. So if you frame the role in that way, then the mandate is with the COO. And that's where you see also in the OT domain, it's much easier to get security in if that's needed, because you're talking about continuity, you're talking about operations. You're not talking about information security. That feels much more an add-on as continuity is. So if you stress the continuity component, then I think then you're much more in the COO, or we should be sort of a COO, but then on the digital part of the operations. So you could split the role, but that would be the most preferred position given the importance of digital process at the moment.
So thank you, and thank you all for your contribution, and a round of applause to the presenters.